So the Houston Rockets season finishes off in the first round against the Golden State Warriors in 7 games, and that's okay because they've been preparing for this outcome all season long. Shout out to the Houston Rockets, certainly one of the biggest surprises throughout this year. Did not believe that they were going to finish second seed in a very competitive Western Conference, a team that was young, rambunctious, defensive-oriented. However, their inexperience and clear limitations offensively eventually was going to catch up to them, and that's exactly what happened in this 7-game series against the Golden State Warriors. And boy, did it look really, really bad when they struggled to score. In the 4 games they lost, they only were able to post up 85 points, then 93, 106, and 89. Struggling to score over 100 points in Big 2025 clearly is not going to be enough to make a deep postseason run. And matter of fact, it's not even suffice enough to get past the first round. But again, not that surprising, and quite frankly, I do believe Houston prepared themselves adequately enough for this situation. However, what I must say is a surprise and, if anything, a big disappointment, which is really, really bad for this team. I mean, a stain now has to be seen on a really good season for them. But I must say, it's not the fact that they were struggling to score 100 points, it's who disappointed them in the process of doing so, because this is a team that, again, has a lot of upside, a lot of talent. Shout out to Jabari Smith, shout out to Tari Eason. Amin Thompson is one of the better stories in the NBA. Young wing, very grit and grimy defender, gets after it, and also offensively, a bit of a utility guy, do a little bit of it all. A lot of vibes of Scottie Pippen, and Alfred Şengün emerged and continued to add to his game. I actually think he was really solid in this series. Finished off averaging 21 points, 12 rebounds, 5 assists, and yes, the shooting splits could have been a little bit better, especially for a big, but matching up against Draymond Green and posting up those type of numbers and being fairly consistent, again, gotta give it credit where credit is due to a 22-year-old. But the player that obviously disappointed, the player that everyone kind of highlights, and the player that this team was looking for a scoring punch, but since he didn't provide it, it will put them in a situation to make a very tough decision in the offseason, and that player is Jaylen Green. Disappointment may not be harsh enough to give a fair and adequate depiction of what happened in this series, but I think it's one that most people may be familiar with. By the end of the series, the 22-year-old guard averaged a measly 13 points, 5 rebounds, 3 assists, and shooting splits of 37% from the field, 29.5% from behind the arc, and 66% from the charity stripe. And the reason why I am highlighting this and why I am so harsh on Jaylen Green is because this was the player that was under the most pressure on this roster, because it was very clear all throughout the season that Houston is ready and prepared to take that next step. Everybody else on this team is living up to expectations. You could very well argue that they are exceeding them, and the only one who is getting left behind is Jaylen Green. And I think a lot of people in the NBA community, there's a couple of ways you can attack what exactly happened with Jaylen in this series, and all of them are fair, understandable, and justifiable. However, I certainly believe that a lot of people are missing the mark on how bad Jaylen was in this series, because even the stat line of 13 points and 3 assists doesn't do it justice to how inadequate of an offensive option he was for a team that desperately needed it in the half-court set, especially when you realize how much heavy lifting Game 2 does for this stat line. If you remove Game 2, his 13 points per game drops all the way to like 9, the shooting splits get worse, and he's averaging even fewer assists. We're talking about a 7-game series where in 4 of the games, Jaylen Green couldn't score in double figures, and for 6 of the 7 games, he couldn't get above 15 points. And in a series where majority of the scores were really, really close, like this came down to the wire, Jaylen didn't even need to be a all-star, a superstar player. He didn't need to be that. He just needed to be a consistent 15 to 20 point scorer, and could have done it inefficiently, and it still would have been enough to get them over the hump. But no, Jaylen couldn't even provide that. And so, taking all that into consideration, it's the reason why I think a lot of people are leaning in a different direction of Houston has to make a decision with Jaylen Green in the upcoming offseason, not only because, again, this is a team that exceeded expectations, that looked very poised and put together all throughout the series. You got to give credit where credit is due, not only to the coaching staff with Ime Udoka and company, but also to these young players, Amin Thompson, Jabari, Şengün, and even the veterans to an extent as well. Fred VanVleet was amazing in the latter half of the series, series, and Dillon Brooks did what he normally does, good and bad. You know, you take that how you want to take it, but he did what he normally does, good and bad. And I think all of that, the culmination of the identity of who this team has been all season long, even put them in a situation to push it to a game 7 where they weren't going to just quit after being down 1-3. And for the people out there who believe that we're being a bit too harsh on Jaylen, that he's only 22 years old, and if this is his first playoff series in his career, all of those things are true. I think those actually are adequate excuses or justifiable reasons for him to play as poorly as he did. However, I still don't believe that it's enough to justify him being on the team because, again, this team is ahead of schedule. They are exceeding expectations, and they definitely want to take advantage of every single year that is given to you, not only because why waste opportunity, but also in a new CBA. When you're able to get the most out of players who are still on rookie deals, trust me when I say that will benefit you to the highest degree in terms of opening up the window of opportunity to compete. So wasting these years really don't make any sense at all. And it makes even more sense because next year is the first year that Jaylen Green is going to be on the first year of his rookie extension. Now, also to be fair to Jaylen, possibly just maybe this isn't the right team for him. Maybe he needs to be on a team with a little bit more floor spacing. And so that also could be a very reasonable and understanding conclusion to come to. But again, all roads point to the fact that this team needs to move in a different direction without Jaylen Green. Now, you may be wondering, why do I keep referring or claiming that Houston was prepared for this? Well, for several reasons. The first being there have been constant conversations about Houston moving off of Jaylen Green because inconsistent offensive outputs from him has been unfortunately consistent. So there's that. The second thing is because of the financial flexibility that this team put themselves into. A couple years ago when they signed both Fred VanVleet and Dillon Brooks to their contracts, they gave them deals that were very movable and manageable, not only for themselves, but for whatever other roster that was willing to take upon them in terms of matching contracts for an inevitable trade, which both of those players are in position to be moved during the offseason as well. So there's that also. But probably the biggest and most interesting talking point when it comes to Houston in terms of their ability to make a big splash in the upcoming offseason has a lot, and I do mean a lot, to do with the amount of draft capital that they have acquired over the past couple of off seasons, in particular last year, where they picked up quite a few of some very valuable Phoenix Suns draft capital. Now, looking at their haul overall, it is very enticing, I must say. They have this year's Phoenix Suns first round pick unprotected, a 2027 Brooklyn Nets pick swap, while also having a 2027 Phoenix Suns pick, again, unprotected. And finally, in 2029, they have the two most favorable picks out of a 3-team selection: Houston, Dallas, or Phoenix. So yeah, the Rockets got a pretty good haul. We all know any pick that is associated with the Phoenix Suns going to be very valuable. I would dare even argue the Brooklyn picks are also going to be interesting to watch as well. And potentially a 2029 pick from Dallas as well. All of those things, very, very interesting. And so when you have that much draft capital, a lot of cap flexibility, because again, you have two veterans on the roster that are on manageable contracts, and everyone else really is either on their rookie deal still or Şengün entering his rookie extension. And you also have a young star in Jaylen Green who you can have someone else take a waiver on, give him a try in another situation. This all is, again, mounting up to a team that once more exceeded expectations and could potentially live up to them and further compete at a high level. And the only thing they need is a competent offensive weapon. Now, with all that being said, I need everyone to pump the brakes. Way too many times do I see people make decisions when it comes to the Houston Rockets that, quite frankly, do not make any sense at all. Even though, yes, it is true that this team needs another offensive weapon. And yes, it is true. It is very easy to just replace Jaylen Green, put him on a roster that is desperate enough to try to take a swing at him, give him a couple draft picks, bada boom, bada bang, it's done. However, we had to take into consideration quite a few things, in particular what exactly the Houston Rockets want. It's a huge reason why I paused for a second, did my research before I made this video, because there are several things pointing to the fact that the Houston Rockets are not going to trade for Kevin Durant. Not only has Houston already came out and said that they're not going to trade for someone who was not on the same timeline, someone who was outside of the age range, but more importantly, it doesn't make any sense for someone like Kevin Durant to be on this roster because he does not fit the adequate needs that this team is looking for. Sure, he is a scorer, but more importantly, this team not just needs a scorer, but also a passer and playmaker. But moreover, it does not make any sense to just randomly throw a lot of money as well as a lot of draft capital to receive someone like Kevin Durant on a roster that still will be inadequate in various different ways, and also give give you a very short window because KD is at a stage of his career where he's probably going to retire while this team is still competing and contending at a very high level. And in all honesty, I feel the same way about Giannis as well. Though Giannis is younger, he's only 30 years old, and he does still feel the identity of what this team needs and is certainly a better passer and playmaker than KD is at this stage of his career. It just doesn't feel right nor give a proper fit on this team that struggles with three-point shooting. Certainly they can address a lot of these concerns with other additions to the roster, and at that point things do become a little bit more interesting, but I just personally don't believe that it's a really great fit with Giannis and Şengün in the front court. I'd rather them have a little bit more three-point shooting alongside Giannis rather than having a low post player that operates in very similar vicinities as Giannis does. But hey, at least that makes a little bit more sense. Certainly a lot more tweaking around the roster that is still needed if they do trade for Giannis. And also it does make sense for the Milwaukee Bucks, as this is a team that is looking to get out of this dead end that they've driven themselves into, not only giving them a young player with some star potential still in Jaylen Green, but more importantly, the adequate enough draft capital as well as manageable contracts for a team that is looking to do a complete restructuring. If you were to trade Jaylen Green and a bunch of draft capital to the Phoenix Suns for Kevin Durant, then I do believe immediately Devin Booker is probably going to ask the question, well, why am I still here? Because it's very clear that you're trying to do a rebuild. And if that were to occur, which I do believe will occur, it would actually make even more sense for someone like Devin Booker to be on the radar of the Houston Rockets rather than Kevin Durant, not only because he's younger, he's a three-point shooter, but also it just makes much more sense for Phoenix to, if they are going to blow it up, it doesn't make any sense for them to blow it up while still having Devin Booker on their roster, move off of D-Book and then move in a different direction. However, with that being said, the player that I do believe that should be on their radar isn't KD, isn't Giannis, isn't D-Book, but it's actually Trae Young. Not too many people are talking about what's going on in Atlanta, and in all honesty, it kind of make a lot of sense. I mean, ain't really much going on out here in the A when it comes to the Hawks. They certainly haven't made enough noise post that Eastern Conference Finals appearance a few years ago, so all that makes sense. But let me tune you in a little bit what's going on out in Atlanta. So this year, another losing season, didn't make a postseason appearance, and the roster has slowly turned into a young core that really and truly doesn't fit the timeline of who Trae Young is at this stage of his career. Trae, 26, looking at 27, certainly should be on a roster that can compete at a high level, but more importantly, a roster that can also defend at a high level to hide his deficiencies. Also give him some big bodies, lob threats, some athletes, something that the Hawks just have not been able to do adequately enough. And when you look at the roster, sure, there's a lot of potential on this team. You have Zachary Ricochet, you have Daniel Dyson, Jalen Johnson, all of these players, a lot of promise, a lot of potential, but doesn't fit the timeline for where Trae is at in his career. And what makes this even more prevalent is that Trae is coming up to a point in his career where he's going to be looking for a contract extension, and more importantly, maybe even looking for a supermax. Now, I do not believe the Hawks are in a situation to justify handing that type of money over Trae Young, not because he's not that good of a player, but simply because they do not have the pieces to properly maximize how many ever years he's going to sign to this team, or at least cannot promise that to him. This team certainly feels more like a rebuilding team, a team that is retooling rather than a team that is emerging and shifting into this next phase of dominance, or at least playoff consistent contending team. That's not where the Hawks are at right now. This is a team that has a lot of 20, 22, 23-year-olds that are looking to find themselves in the NBA. And to me, that's why it makes the most sense to shift over Jaylen Green to the Atlanta Hawks, Trae Young to the Houston Rockets. Jaylen Green will go on a roster that will have a defensive guard in the backcourt with him and Dyson Daniels, have some athletes out there with him as well, but much better three-point shooting that can probably provide the floor spacing that he needs, because he's not the same scoring option that can function in that role. While Trae Young goes to a roster that will still have some quality athletes surrounding him, but more importantly, the defensive pieces that they desperately need, while also having some wiggle room to fill in the rest of the holes to immediately put them in title contention. And in my opinion, that's the reason why it makes the most sense to make this move. I do believe if you're going to be optimistic about who Jaylen Green is as a player, the Atlanta Hawks, to me, is the best situation for him. low expectations, a team that's retooling, giving him the pieces surrounding him that can potentially maximize who he is as a player with better floor spacing, and again, a little bit longer of a runway. Sometimes it takes players a little bit longer than their third or fourth year before they can compete for a deep postseason run. And so that's all understandable. You're certainly going to get that if you're out in Atlanta. And oh yeah, finally, Trae Young is going to make significantly less money than Kevin Durant and even Giannis. So that would also make a lot of sense. But hey, those are my thoughts. Let me know yours. At the end of the day, the Houston Rockets are certainly going to make a lot of noise in this upcoming offseason. So can't wait.